Hello and welcome back to the Transfer Flow podcast. And on today's episode, Liverpool pull away in the title race. But what did we learn from the three matches of the title contenders this weekend? Does Arteta take too long to make his subs? How could Phil Foden improve Manchester City's chances? And then we look at Man United Chelsea, a game of zero competence, but plenty of entertainment for me at least. That's all in today's episode. So we're back for another Monday roundup. And when I say we, I mean me, Patrick Van Straten, and Ted Knudsen. How are you doing, Ted?
I'm right. It's good to be here. We're in the dark times of year. So everybody's changed their time now. And it's dark. And we're starting to settle into the flow of we got one more international break. So it's good. But as you said, like the title race is what we want to talk about a little bit today anyway.
Yeah, well, we're 10 games in. And so, things are starting to get serious. We can start to draw some conclusions. And all three big teams had big matchups this weekend. Liverpool had Brighton at home. City went away to Bournemouth. Arsenal went away to Newcastle. And Liverpool were the only ones to escape with points. So I guess we should have a quick look at Liverpool. This was a difficult matchup on paper. And in the first half, it was a difficult matchup on turf as well. An interesting setup from Hertzler in this game.
Yeah, so Kadioglu got pushed up. So he was a late. One of the warnings that we put in the gambling update was, hey, check on the lineups because Brighton have a lot of injuries right now. And Baliba also, I think, was yanked out for potential knee issue. Like the nice part about Hertzler and Brighton is that they're aware that they have a lot of young players and they need to be a little bit careful about them. So anyway, first half, very interesting. Kadioglu actually ends up sort of making a lovely run, finishing a run, picks up a ball that spilled and a great finish. And yeah, Brighton are flying despite the fact that they didn't have what was anywhere near their starting 11 at Anfield.
And then what's interesting though about it to me is that you watch the game and it felt like Brighton were up at the Liverpool backline kind of constantly. But after the match, when I look at the expected goals tally, it didn't really turn into that many clear looks at goal. I think they ended up with like 1 XG. And I thought that was not particularly reflective of the amount of danger it felt Liverpool were facing defensively.
So I think we've seen this a couple of times with Brighton, and we see this more and more with the Premier League. It is a league that has very dangerous transition moments over and over again. And that's because there's so much talent in the league, in the attacking spots, that the best teams or even just good attacking teams now are able to keep that pretty high level of tension. Now, they don't always turn into good chances, but the reality is if one of those gets missed, like, for example, what happened with Crystal Palace at Wolves, where Chalobah just donks a header and suddenly like it's a 2v1 on the goal. If one of those chances gets missed, and this is how stressful it is to play as a Premier League, it's basically half or more of an expected goals chance that's going to come at the goal. So Liverpool kind of weathered the storm for the first part and then created their own storm in the second half, and it was 2 goals in 2 minutes to basically put away the game. First one felt like it was a bit lucky from Gakpo. Then the second one is somebody misplaying Mohamed Salah. So like fullback he's got his body all in the wrong position. You always want to cover the inside on the left footer. Salah is awesome, and he's awesome with his left. He's a little worse, or potentially quite a bit worse with his right. You want to show him right if you can at all. That didn't happen, and that ball was just hammered into the side netting from a pretty tough angle. But those players can do that anytime they want.
Yeah, and I completely agree. The way that Liverpool were able to kind of get through to halftime at rough parity and then just pull away in the second half was actually really quite impressive. And I thought that Kostas Tsimikas had a good game in this match. I think he had something like 0.8 expected goals assisted in this game and completed 7 of 7 tackles, which if he can turn into I guess that's a lot of traffic for him to face, but still, if he can be a good option for them at left back, then that's really going to help them this season.
He's been there a long time.
He has.
He was like a pandemic transfer or something like that basically they needed depth at left back. I think it's important. One of the things that was pointed out recently was how long that Liverpool squad has sort of like been in rotation. Like they have an average of something like 53 months that they've been around the club. So that actually makes it much easier to have those sort of transitions of eras. Like if you're buying players early, and then able to put them into the lineup as they're needed. I think what we're seeing in Robertson is that he's losing some of his legs. He certainly cannot do the frequency of games that he used to be able to. It doesn't mean he's not still a good player, but it does mean that they're probably aware that they need to manage his minutes quite a bit more. Same thing to some extent that Chelsea's doing with Reece James, although for different reasons. James is much more, his body will just sort of fly apart if you try and play him too frequently in intense situations. So that's the case where like fullback is the most intense role on the pitch for the most part. And I think that they are now aware that they need to platoon that, which is sort of how we referred to that in the US a bit more often. Just change regularly who is starting in that role and occasionally bring in backups.
Well, and now especially they've got an insane run that they've got to really weather. I mean, they're fortunate in that they're at home for a lot of this run, but they've got Leverkusen at home, Villa at home, Saints away, Real Madrid at home, Manchester City at home, and then Newcastle away. And then after that, I think it's Everton away. So, I mean, this is an interesting run to show us how good Liverpool actually are. I mean, like they're obviously good, but Arsenal have fallen away behind. City have fallen a couple of points behind. If Liverpool can get through this period and they're still ahead or still right there with City, then that starts to look incredibly exciting for them going into Christmas.
So I wanted to kind of lean on this and be excited about Liverpool, and the gambling markets still have City as favorites. But there's two things going on here. One, there's that run, and Liverpool haven't faced City yet, and they've got some very challenging times ahead. They have the deepest attacking cadre of anybody. Maybe sure. Chelsea are sort of on par, but like their quality's worse. But there have been a lot of years where Manchester City have looked like they were going into November, and it doesn't look good, and somebody's gonna take the title, and it's only happened in one. So. Yeah. I feel like we've seen the situation enough times, knowing that City have real firepower that they can spend in January if they find the right targets, and they probably will do so. I'm going to be a little cautious on this one. I mean, I think they're very good, but I think that also the challenges against even teams that are facing or putting their half of their second string out, which is Brighton away at Anfield, is tougher than it potentially could be. So they're a very good, solid team. But I don't know that there is an elite team in the league this year, and I think that makes for a lot of fun for neutrals and also for people who just like to see close races. I hope that it continues that way. And only 2 points it's not a big enough deal, right? This is the first game City have lost this year. It's not like they're on their fourth.
Sure. I mean, I guess the issue is how many of these injuries are going to last a little while and whether they can get those replacements through the door in January. I mean, the thing is, when you look at their lineup that they played away at Bournemouth, it's not really weak. It's still Ederson, Walker, Akanji, Ake, Gvardiol, Kovacic, Silva, Gundogan, Foden, Nunes, and Haaland. Like, so it's one of those things where they've got a ton of injuries, so they can't really do much off the bench. And all these guys are tired. But at the same time, like the team that went out there is good enough to get a result, clearly.
They are. They won't always get a result, though, especially against the good teams and especially away. City have two things going right now. They've aged a bit. So like I think City like have this sort of aging cycle. They had a bit of time where they were replenishing fairly regularly, but this team is fairly old from a City perspective. So they need to like restock the cupboard effectively with some elite players. And it doesn't feel like they've had like a truly elite transfer since Haaland, right? Like that. Maybe there've been other ones that have come and go, but so City have a fairly old group that are there, which means that they can play a lot of Pep style without having to think too much about it. But the counterpoint to that is like there's not a lot of youth that's good right now, and they are missing like real depth in a couple of positions. So I think that if they don't go for it, then that creates a huge opening for probably Liverpool to step into it. Arsenal are good this year, and I think Arsenal are better than they were last year, but the injuries are biting them. And there will be times when you just play suffer ball for too long and you have too many things going against you, and the results will go poorly. The great teams have to play relatively high paced, and they have to use their talent advantage over and over and over again. That's how you create a bigger gap of expected goals or otherwise, against everybody else in the league. If you're just trying to grind out and trying to play for moments of individual brilliance, like that is a more fragile strategy, and you'll have results like you did this weekend.
Yeah, and I think you look at City's game with Bournemouth, and it ended up at about 2.4 expected goals apiece in that game. So you can kind of understand that attitude. Like, we're going to go out, we're going to attack super, super hard, and we presume that, well, I mean, a lot of that came on at the end, but we presume that our attackers will be able to make that stuff tell. That kind of makes sense to me. Whereas the Arsenal game, I guess what's bad about that is that Arsenal go out there with the suffer ball intention, and then once they go a goal down extremely early, they're totally incapable of changing it for the rest of that game. That's what's really shocking about that match to me.
Yeah, when you don't have great passing in the midfield and you don't have Odegaard
Mm,
that potentially unlocks somebody a little bit more, like this is what happens, right? Like we've seen a lot of teams over the years just sort of run into the wall over and over. And Arsenal have had set pieces in order to help break that. And when I was back at Brentford, when we built a style of play that said that, okay, what are the things that help us unlock different situations? Like the long throws and corners were, and for Arsenal, it's also wide free kicks, were the thing that was like, look, there'll be plenty of times where teams are very happy to concede a lot of set pieces or like throws deep in the final third. If we can create those as goal situations, that gives us like a much bigger chance to be able to
mm,
get that extra goal than we used to, along with all the other talented attacking patterns that we have. If that's all that you have and you don't have the talented attacking patterns that Arsenal kind of have displayed since the Wenger era, then yeah, your job's a lot harder. You have to hope that something happens in transition, which sometimes it does, and that a set piece comes through, or that you manage to get one of those more unusual open play goals that at sort of 0-0 or 1-1 that are harder to come by.
And in this game as well, like, I mean, I thought it was a bad game for pretty much the entire Arsenal team. I thought it was a really bad game for Arteta as well. Nwaneri comes on in this game and basically doesn't really do much. He has a shot, and I thought that's what happens when a teenager comes on and has had essentially no minutes of professional football. But it felt like Arteta as well was extremely conservative with substitutes. Like, given what you're saying there were loads of times in this game where Newcastle were able to double up on the wingers, and normally there would be a trade-off there, right? Because you'd have Odegaard in more space in the centre. But in this match, almost no penetrative passing in the centre, and you've got Trossard and Havertz who are kind of asked to do the creation. It felt like this was a match where Gabriel Jesus' central dribbling ability, and probably Jorginho as well for a bit more of that penetrative passing, would have made sense as early substitutions. Jesus comes on at the left wing, Jorginho comes on at 86 minutes. Substitutions have been a bit of a whine in the Arsenal fan base. I guess that applies to literally everything. But they have been a bit of a whine in the Arsenal fan base.
We might be fans, but we'll be critical of ourselves as well, because unfortunately we have to listen to this nonsense.
Exactly. So I wanted to ask you about substitutions and whether managers, and especially I guess managers of very, very talented squads, are too conservative with their substitutions.
Yeah, so we did analysis on this pretty early, and one thing people should be aware of is like with longer stoppage times, players have to play more, right? And there's a fatigue barrier that you find sort of in the 55, 60 minutes, and then there's like another one that kind of happens like in the 75 to 80th minute. As you get into stoppage time, you see a lot of goals, and part of that is there's extra time there, but people are tired and like really tired. It's also really hard to sit on a lead for a long period of time, and it takes one mistake in order to end up as a goal. Part of the joy of football is that it's a low scoring game, so like you see more variance and you feel like you should see more upsets. But also part of the pain is that like these come late into the match. So let's deal with Arteta first. And I think that we should probably deal with the broader news that happened today as well,
Sure.
which is that Edu Gaspar is apparently leaving Arsenal. He has been recruited to go elsewhere. It's not officially named yet. Potentially it's part of the Nottingham Forest group, maybe in almost a Michael Edwards role where he's sort of overseeing multiple clubs as opposed to a single one. I mean, you don't want to change much about Forest at the moment because they're doing so well, but also if you wanted to continue on the long-term vision, maybe Edu's a pretty good one because he's been inside of a club that's been successful and seems to be pretty good at the recruitment side as well. With the subset, though, there's two things that Arteta is most criticized for. One is like his squad management is terrible, right? And he will play guys into the ground. He's almost the fucking Tom Thibodeau If you're an NBA fan,
Yeah,
he
yeah,
just
big time.
grinds his team so badly, and they end up being totally gassed by the time the playoffs roll around. They might have great regular seasons, but there's nothing left in the tank. For Arteta, like, he tends to have a smaller squad that has caused problems with the sell-on value of some players, because like these young players are not getting enough minutes for teams to be comfortable, even if they're not good enough for Arsenal. Like, what is their actual potential performance level? But then you also just end up guys with tired, and then tired yields more injuries and more soft tissue injuries.
Yeah.
And those things all roll up together. And the more injuries you have, the more you have to play your starters or like the good players in longer minutes periods. And so you don't get the rotations as well. It's a compounding effect that's particularly bad. The way to offset some of this, though, is to have sort of 55, 60 minutes, 65-minute stints of a lot of players, and then have scheduled rotations, right? And sometimes, I think Son actually was on a scheduled rotation this weekend, even if they didn't say it. He got taken off at like a pretty crucial moment. It felt like Spurs were, picking apart Aston Villa almost at will at that point.
Yeah.
People were like, oh my God, why would you take him off? But he had come off of an injury, and they want to maintain his minutes. He's pretty old. He seemed frustrated about it. And then they go on to win 4-1. So like, it seems like, yeah, okay, we took that risk and it worked out. Let's go ahead and talk about when it works out, as opposed to the moments when they yank somebody and then like all of a sudden the attacks get stifled because of it, right? The problem with Arteta is that he seems like he's had a deeper bench recently, and he still doesn't make those changes. And it does yield compounding effects with the squad management and the injury status.
Yeah. So is this an area where what is the kind of analysis here of like what is the best approach? Just to have 65 minutes, you have what, two guys? How many can you change at once without it having a real effect on the momentum of the team?
So there's a couple of different things, and obviously part of it is the individual, right? So you have to start with the individual. What does their red line look like? Are they somebody like Reece James, where you really just cannot put them in more than 90 minutes a week because like that's it?
Yeah.
Or are they somebody that's like Alexis Sanchez, who seems like he can run forever and ever and ever and never has injury problems and does that, right? There's a gap between those types of things. Also, what does this particular game look like? Like, if you're getting a lot of value from fullback overlaps or underlaps, but these are fullback sprints, maybe at the 65th minute, like, those guys are completely gassed. And if your fullbacks are gassed at the end of the game, that's actually the time that are most transitions and most wide transitions, and you need to be worried about that. So there's a tactical element and sort of maintaining the integrity of your squad and keeping an eye on what's going on in this particular game. But as a general rotation concept, the thing that I just said about fullbacks is true for everybody's fullbacks. And so if you have the ability to get players on that are fresh, that can run at them, and your other guys have had kind of a tired period, then maybe like you want to have like a regular scheduled rotation and transition of it. Or you get the other element, which is game state related. So do we need to break down a particular team? Like, Jorginho gives you a little bit better passing and a little less suffer ball element of it. And if you needed to be able to find somebody with some creative passing, he's one guy that you bring on much earlier so that you can get those unlocks. Yeah, what I want to say is that you need to be super conscious of your overall kind of minutes bank of everybody. You need to be conscious of the red lines and the fatigue of everybody and their injury history, whatever. But then you also need to like specifically adapt to particular matchups and particular games all the time. It's a complicated element, but it's a little bit like time management in the NFL. Like, it's not that complicated. Like, maybe you just need to have somebody giving you good advice all the time about, hey, coach, I'm seeing this up in the box. Like, this guy's clearly gassed. Like, we need to get a sub in like right away, or we should get our planned subs in at 57 because we know that the first half was super intense and guys came out and saying they were really tired. These are all the things you need to be aware of to be at like a super elite level, and to manage these very expensive squads in their minutes at the right level.
It sounds like there's going to be an element of mindset change, a kind of humility that coaches are going to have to try and understand now. In the same way that when Premier League clubs started to move from the manager is God of everything to maybe other people can take some stuff off their plate, it felt like there was a really bloody transition there for some people.
It continues to be, and sometimes it gets retracted, right? Sometimes you see Michael Edwards and Ian Graham and Liverpool's brain trust be like, yeah, I'm not sticking around for this. Like, they're going to give all the power to Klopp, and I'm not going to be responsible for it. I'm also not going to spend 70 hours a week like living that life. That's horrible, because it's not whatever happens is is not my fault, but also not to my credit. Like, that's not an
Yeah.
interesting job for really smart, ambitious people. And the question really for me is a little bit around. So Mikel's been good at learning. He was hired because they thought he was a smart guy, but also like pretty EQ, like emotionally in touch with things.
Mm-hmm.
He felt like he had the building blocks or something, but he's also been super raw over the course of the last X years. You can see him learning on the fly. Edu leaving is interesting because one, I mean, it could just be he got a huge offer from somewhere else to leave, but it could also be Mikel's sort of like taking the power. He's had a couple of good seasons. The ego's getting bigger. We see this happen, this pattern over and over again. The question then becomes, who do Arsenal bring in? Like, what does that structure look like? We talked a little bit about Newcastle and what their kind of battle was around Eddie Howe and should this be happening or not. But the thing about Mikel that I'm particularly intrigued by is like when he has taken on outside advice, like a Nico Jover, and it's been successful, like he's been able to be like, oh, that's a big part of our success as a club. Can he kind of condense his ego and keep it centered so that they can be more successful? Or is he going to be the type that overreaches, wants his handpicked guy to be able to do this stuff? Nobody knows right now. And there's nothing in the media that clearly indicates one way or another what happens here. There may be leaks behind the scenes that happen over the course of the next month or two. But I'm intrigued by it because it's a kind of critical point at Arsenal's future and what happens with the path.
It's almost you wonder if it will end up being helpful in some way that Arsenal are not really flying right now, because you could imagine that if Arsenal were top of the league, if they were in this position that Liverpool were in, then it would be a situation where Arteta could potentially leverage that into far too much power at the club.
Head coach is God, who we've seen it happen so many times, and then usually it fails, but it's still a thing that happens.
Just so I wanted to touch on Manchester City before we moved on. I mean, obviously, look, there's a ton of injuries for Man City. There's a ton of injuries for Arsenal, even though Arsenal's squad should have been more than capable of putting in a way better performance than this. Scott Willis, at Scott J. Willis on Twitter, had a really interesting chart where he used the transfer marked value of the players out injured to estimate the value of the team that was missing right now. And he had 25% of Man City's squad is out, 20% of Arsenal's, 26% of United's. This is compared to 11% for Liverpool. This does feel, I don't know, I might as well just ask you straight out. Are Arsenal out of this?
18 points versus 25 right now, 10 games. I don't think they're strictly out of it. I think Liverpool have tough games coming up. I think that playing even reasonable players in the Carabao Cup's probably not the best way to manage a short squad for the rest of the season. So I think that 7 is on the edge. I think that it's sort of like right there. And it's not just 7 points out, but it's like how many teams are also above you? How many good teams are there around you? Even if we assume that Arsenal are effectively the equivalent of last year, that mostly just puts them in the range of City and Liverpool for the rest of the season. Chelsea are about half of that in terms of like expected goal difference. But then you get like Spurs, who've been pretty legit good and thumped a good team this weekend as well. So it's a challenging league. The good part about there being a lot of teams that are good but not great is that you could see variance going in your favor. But if you're sort of statistically modeling this out, it's going to take a bit of luck. And Liverpool right now have the luck on their side in terms of injuries and the rub. City are almost impossible to overcome. It really does just over the next 2 months and follow us on the transferflow.com/subscribe. We will start writing about transfers probably in 2-3 weeks from now as the rumor mill heats up. If you see those hot rumors coming through on the City side and they're not just nonsense agent leaks, like that will give you an indication as to whether they're going to reload or not. If they don't, anything could happen.
Yeah, and it's interesting this weekend that obviously they were completely incapable of stopping attacks again. But interesting as well that they were getting Phil Foden into the zones where you'd want to see him. I think he got 4 shots, 2 key passes in this game. I think he was at 1 expected goal and expected assist combined in this match. He almost equalizes with that shot from the top of the box near the end. And this is something that's been talked about in a few places, including here, that this is the kind of shot City have maybe been missing with De Bruyne out, even with Rodri out. So that could add an element of danger for them, I think.
They could start putting up 4 and 5 spots given the attacking that they've been doing. It's quite funny. Last year was the time when Klopp teams sort of defended the loosest, and they were just super high tempo and sort of high frequency games. That happens often towards the end of the era of sort of a general pressing team. City are not a normal pressing team. They have a very specific Klopp-esque way that they, or not Klopp, but Pep-esque way that they play. But if they decide to up the tempo, like that's a very interesting way to play. It's probably okay for them if they feel like they can't control games regularly. But all of Pep's career has been control, control, control. Like you hear Henry talking about him going into Barcelona in the early eras, and he got fucking yanked and subbed out no matter how much money he made if he was not playing exactly the role that that Pep wanted out of possession. That's the truth for the whole squad. No one is bigger than he is, but he's adapted and he is continuing to do so. Like he's hyper competitive. He wants another one.
I would love to see it. If Manchester City with kind of 13 outfield players said, you know what, we are going to play the most insane up and down football. But, you know, you've got to keep the mind alive after you've been doing it for as long as Pep has, I guess. Shall we move on to Manchester United-Chelsea? Because actually, as you were talking about Arsenal being on the edge of out of contention, they go away to Chelsea next week. Chelsea were away at Manchester United, though. This game finished 1-1. Had loads of defensive breakdowns this game, attackers running in space, just total carnage. Could have been a couple of red cards in it. Man United, very lucky in this match, I think. You know, Ugarte was honestly, he stayed on the pitch through a prayer. I just don't know how it happened. Martinez,
that felt worse. That felt worse than the Teflon stuff that Fernandinho used to get away with. Like Fernandinho was the player in the league that just infuriated you the most if you were playing against him, because he'd have like a good 4 fouls before he got the first yellow card. And then like there'd be a couple more where you felt like, come on, like you've got to punish this guy. It's so obvious, but you're obviously rooting as a fan. The Ugarte ones were really obvious. Like this was like way beyond the pale, and somehow the cards were kept in the pocket. I mean, it took him 5 fouls to get the first one, right?
That's kind of cool though. I almost respect that. It's like a Rodri level of ability to dodge that many yellow cards. But then the Martinez one,
it feels pure Uruguayan to me. I don't know.
It's I don't know. I mean, I feel like the more Uruguayan thing would have been to get a red card for the first one. But
no, that's the late one. So it's like the early Uruguayan era was just like kick the bejesus out of somebody, their legs hanging off. Like this is this is the kinder, gentler, a little more savvy Uruguayan era. Like not as much biting people, like little less kicking in obvious ways, more subtle kicking is what they've gone for.
Okay. Again, this has been your obligatory racism segment.
Still racism. Watch the small children play football in that country, and you understand where it comes from.
Look, I have no beef with the people of Uruguay. But Lisandro Martinez also, my God, like the fact that got reviewed and was upheld was kind of astonishing to me. And this is the area where, look, you know, we don't want to get into the referee thing too much, but it is fairly clear that refs don't want to embarrass other refs, you know, and hang them out to dry. And given that it is probably one of the most difficult and unpleasant jobs that you could be doing, I do understand that, but it just feels like it makes the situation worse that these things are reviewed and everyone says, yeah, that looks fine. I guess his stud's going to his knee. That seems okay.
The fact that both of them were happening, right? Like it was already a very chippy game. Already one guy should have been sent off. And then the other guy, who is a known hothead that does dumb things in pressured games, does this. And it's against the guy that seems like he has a huge PR campaign from the Premier League recently about like how good is Cole Palmer. And he's been awesome. And they don't protect him. I'm just like, none of this makes any sense. And you should be protecting him because that's like really dangerous, right? And yet, no, it doesn't happen. So in my gambling breakdown on Friday, I was like, I think United will get tired here. And I think Chelsea are going to make hay in the second half, because like we saw that in the earlier week, we saw them sort of play their players in the cup midweek as well. And you're like, look, they don't have the squad to play a full 90 if they've had a midweek. And then they did get tired, but they somehow did not get punished for it. And that was basically what we saw and why it ended 1-1 as opposed to probably 2 or 3-1 with a red card at some point, either for a second yellow or for Martinez.
Yeah, kind of like we were talking about with Brighton in the Liverpool game. It felt like there were a ton of defensive breakdowns that led to relatively few clear scoring chances. I mean, especially I thought Rasmus Højlund had just had a terrible game where nothing came off. I mean, he ends up winning the penalty, though I think that's more through the stupidity of Sanchez than Højlund's skill.
They have 9 goalkeepers. Why is that guy still playing?
They could just rotate every week. But it just feels like...
To give me the least bad option. Like, give me somebody that can kick and basically stand in the right spot. Sorry.
No. I mean, I get it because he's just like, he's running off the pitch. He's going out for a goal kick. What are you doing?
I have zero idea what Maresca sees in Sanchez. I've watched, as people who've been following this know, I've watched a good degree of Chelsea games because I thought they were fun, right? And I wanted to see, like, they have a very stacked squad. They have a deep enough squad to literally play a cup squad starting 11 and a league starting 11. But then you get this thing, and the funniest part about all of this is, like, in the transfer stuff that happened in the summertime, like, they have like 9 paid goalkeepers that are senior squad players. What is going on here? And then this guy is the one that's between the sticks every week. You're like, it makes no sense to me. But that's part of the fun of the Premier League.
I mean, from a Manchester United perspective, I was kind of pleasantly surprised at their playing out. I thought this is quite damning for Erik ten Hag that United seemed actually quite capable of playing out of pressure and getting up the field with relative ease. It's interesting.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, and I think that people have looked at that squad and they're like they're a bit more talented than their results, certainly, but also even than their execution. And then this happens, and you're like, yeah, it feels like it's they're able to breathe. They have a little less pressure on them. They're not completely suffocated by some sort of system that they have to be doing. It doesn't mean that this is good for the long term necessarily, because systemic tactical play versus vibes is probably pretty important. But yeah, the thing that you mentioned also about them just being able to clean up the Chelsea danger, like, that's actually a pretty decent sign from a back line and a midfield that have been ridiculed for most of this year and even the last 18 months. So Amorim's going to come in. There's going to be changes. This is like the kind of 1 month vibes period until he fully takes over. And yeah, we'll see. We'll let these guys play a little, is kind of what I feel happened there. They played all right. It wasn't horrible, but certainly they also should have been down a man at some point.
Yeah, definitely. From a Chelsea perspective, Chelsea fans have been getting quite excited, and I think it's fine to be excited if you're a Chelsea fan. I guess I suppose you're allowed to feel joy, but Cole Palmer in this game, they try and kick him out of the game. He still gets his shots, gets his chances created. He's just an unbelievable machine. But my question is whether Chelsea have really improved tactically under Maresca, or are we looking at a team that has a couple of guys who are just really good? I mean, Jackson's been great. Palmer's been phenomenal. Moises Caicedo, you talked a bit about him in the newsletter, and I thought he was pretty great in this game, though at the same time, a lot of danger running at Chelsea's backline. But, he's looked great this season, for sure. I'm finding it hard to locate in this what Maresca's doing super, super well.
I agree with you, but I also feel like sometimes it does take longer for that type of stuff to get imprinted. He doesn't feel better than average right now as a head coach. Does that mean that he will be? I'm not sure. Like, they're not defensively suffocating anybody. They do have talent advantage, but yeah, they're giving up 12 and a half shots a game. Like, that's a lot. And that's more like a mid-block thing where that Forest are giving up. You're not looking at the elites. The elites are going to be below 10 in sort of shots conceded across season after season. So right now, I think that your read on this and your slight amount of confusion is probably correct. They do have like some great attackers. They've been running a little bit hot there. I think the refs haven't always helped them in the last couple of games as well, which maybe they'll get the rub the other way. But The jury's still out on Maresca and how good this team should be with an elite coach versus how good they currently are.
Yeah, and I guess he is still a very young head coach. I mean, it's like Arteta in that way. Like Arsenal were shit for a long time under Arteta, and I guess we thought, okay, well, the squad's in a bad position, and he's trying to work it out. But also, I guess he was getting his own reps there, like working out how to coach against other really, really good managers.
Or just figuring out that you shouldn't cross it a bunch, even though somebody told you that crosses were a useful way to get the ball closer to goal. I don't know. Again, it's the Arteta ascent is confusing. Like, we don't know who's whispering to these guys. Hopefully, it's not Bowley and Egdad, because the things that we've heard from the Tuchel era was that they said very confusing, useless things. But I don't know. Again, 10 games is not a huge sample to judge somebody by, but there's also usually a signal at this point as to what's going on. And so Chelsea seem fine, but they certainly don't seem like, sustainably above kind of that third, fourth spot. They're not rocking themselves into title contention at the moment.
No, I don't think so either. Is there anything else that you think we should discuss before we go?
Before we go,
Throw something at me, Ted.
Well, we could talk about the ups and downs of Villa and Spurs, which I think is...
Yeah.
Spurs in particular are volatile. Let's say that. They have this incredible habit of giving up an early goal and then scoring lots of goals later. And if you can make that a pattern, that's really good. Maybe you can not give up the early goal, but still score lots of goals later. That seems like a better way to go about things. I don't know how much of this is like Ange ball versus how much is, but they create great transition moments over and over again, and particularly at home. And it's not just their players. Like, there are lots of players that are capable of doing that. I think Son is unique and remains unique among most of the players, because there are very few that are as two-footed as he is, that also has kind of that ball striking ability and the pace. But even so, like, even when Son's not around, they still manage to do a lot of this stuff. So it feels like last week against Crystal Palace was just that sort of miserable blip. Feels like most of the teams are in that phase where they are having miserable blips, because we're in the tired time. We're in the time where it gets darker. It just gets worse from here through Christmas time. And then once you get to the other side of the holidays, then you usually get a break or two with the early FA Cup rounds. And sometimes, like, so I remember seeing Raheem Sterling when he was a baby, getting off a plane from England to Miami, and then he was going on to Jamaica. And what actually happens in kind of that January, February period is a lot of times coaches they'll have some sort of knock, right? But the reality is, my guys need a break, because a 10-month season is too long. And I need to find a way to get them some way to relax. And he had the Mbappe story where he rented out like a nightclub or something like that, and had a quote unquote injury. But the reality is, he just needed a break. And keeping your sort of mental facilities high during a whole league is tough. Now, don't overdo it, obviously. But from November until the end of December in England, it's like nowhere else in the world. Like, they play more matches, and they play more matches in hard, tough conditions. So Spurs, interesting. How much are all of these teams though rotating? How much depth do all of these teams have to be able to do that? And then Villa are the weirdos. Like, I thought Villa would be able to come in and really contain this match, and they did nothing of the sort.
No.
This was a super high tempo game. This is not what Emery's teams are comfortable playing ever. They had a couple of really good chances, and actually the expected goals were way closer than I thought, especially given the highlights. So it means that it was a ropey game from both sides. Spurs came out on the good side of it, but didn't have to go that way. But the highlights were funny. Like, I watched all the highlights this morning, trying to dig for like some deeper bits. And they were just like, no, Spurs owned this match. There was Villa were barely in it when Spurs turned it on. I'm like, none of that comes through in the stats right now. It feels like it's pretty close. So I don't know what to think about Villa, but I definitely know that Spurs are good. And for Spurs fans, that must be like, oh, we actually are good. That's really nice. I'm not that I'm the authority in goodness or not, but looking at the top 7 teams right now, and that includes Nottingham Forest.
That does include Nottingham Forest.
It's hard to separate them, minus kind of even those top 2, Liverpool and City. Arsenal, if they're healthy, are really good. City have been knocked down because they're unhealthy. but like there's a block of contention that includes Forest that you're like, all these teams are legit. All these teams can beat each other up. And the ones lower down can also take points off of them unless they're the horrible teams.
Yeah. I think the thing about Spurs is they should be able to reliably beat these teams lower down in the league, which I do think gives them an advantage over some of these other sides. Chelsea, I think, could kind of do more in attack. I mean, I guess that feels ridiculous to say, given Palmer and Jackson, but given their enormous wealth of talent and their ability to pretty much change over the entire attack and still have a top 6 quality front line, it does feel like they should be able to make a little bit more out of that. Forest are just absolutely flying. I don't even know what to say about that. But Villa, yes, I think they were better in this game than the scoreline suggests. I also think that they could easily have lost the game that they won against Fulham a couple of weeks ago. So,
Sure.
Sometimes maybe good, sometimes maybe shit. I would definitely back Spurs over them at this stage. I think Spurs are going to have some absolutely humiliating results this season. I just think it's the nature of this style. But they're gonna get some signature wins as well. I don't know. I'd be quite excited if I'm a Spurs fan. Your team is probably the most entertaining team to watch in the league, and they're actually good. That's quite a rare combination.
Yeah, and the noise and the frustration around Ange was so much for a little while. Like it feels like, and also Brennan Johnson. Oh, Brennan Johnson just sucks. He's terrible. Man, Brennan Johnson is one of the best young attackers in the league, and you guys are just spewing nonsense because he actually can create. He hasn't been doing that necessarily this year. He scored a lot of goals, but like taking it out of the top 6, right? Let's extend this to like the top 13. Looking from Tottenham upward, obviously we just talked about that, but Brighton are really good. Brighton can go toe-to-toe with anybody, especially if they have their full squad. Bournemouth are really good. Bournemouth can go toe-to-toe with most teams and cause real problems, right? So now we're only at 9th. Newcastle, when they've been healthy, have been quite challenging for the last month in particular. We hit Brentford. Brentford also health problems, right? But like when Brentford are pretty good, like the set pieces are going to eke out some results, so they could flip some teams. You just talk about Fulham and how Fulham could have beaten Aston Villa the other weekend. So like now we're at 12th, and then the 13th team is Manchester United, and Manchester United under a good head coach is probably going to be able to take some scalps as well. That's 13 teams deep right now, where any particular game could go either way. And I think that's why I get excited every week, either writing the previews or the roundups, because I can't remember a time where it felt like it was this dicey for any particular, this team is like a 2.5 goal favorite. Yeah, there's a few teams right now that could be 2.5 goal favorites, but honestly, those aren't even panning out either. And there's a lot of stuff that's in like the 0.75 to 1.2. So around 1 goal favorites. When you're around 1 goal favorites, like it's only a 5-1 that the other team actually wins. That's a pretty exciting thing. And if that happens twice a weekend, that's great. Like the storylines are great. Every team is going crazy. And as much as you hate to be the chaos team and the team that's like in turmoil, you love to see your rivals that way, right? Like how much fun is it when like Chelsea and Spurs are both melting down at the same time? You're like, this just give me more of this. I just want to breathe this in for as long as I can. So yeah, I think that this year in particular, we see a little more parity than we have, partly due to injuries, partly due to some flaws, but also partly due to some teams that have been constructed very well this year. And that is unusual in my experience across following this league from a gambling perspective since 2007.
I think it's a great time to be covering the Premier League, and it's a great time to be a sort of Rob Lowe style like fan of the sports. But as a rooting fan, I would say that it's not the most enjoyable unless
is it more stressful than it has been before?
I don't know. It doesn't feel good, Ted. I don't really enjoy it, I've got to say. But look, I imagine it's the same for Italian fans this season because that league is also bananas. And I imagine we will probably cover the title race in that division, which has once again gone even more bananas this weekend. I think that brings us to a close for this episode. If you'd like us to cover anything in particular, then put it in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this, then do like and subscribe to the channel, or leave us a 5-star review if you're listening to us on your favorite podcast app. Make sure that you're following the Transfer Flow on social media. Make sure that you're subscribed to the newsletter if you'd like to hear Ted's betting picks, which I also think is just interesting from the point of view of following the games. I think it really ties in with what we try and do on this side as well. Then you can sign up for variance betting, and we'll catch you next time.
Yeah, lots of free content. Hopefully you guys have been great enjoying it. You've been great in clicking subscribe on the YouTube. We're almost over 4,000, which I think is something completely unexpected to us. And then the newsletter is ticking up. It'll definitely be over 10,000 people that follow us by the end of the year, and possibly much more than that. So from starting from nothing and in June, it feels like there's a lot of momentum behind this, and people are responding. So thank you again for all of that, and we'll do our best to keep it up.
Bye.